Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Carbon Clarity series hosted by Green Impact. We're thrilled to have you with us today as we kick off our inaugural entry in this new series focused on advancing carbon accounting, emissions reporting, and sustainability technology. My name is Kevin Dole, and I am the Senior Sustainability Advisor at Green Impact. At Green Impact, our mission is to support sustainability leaders like you in navigating the ever-evolving ESG landscape. In today's session, Carbon Reporting Without the Chaos, we will dive into the complexity of compliance, the common pitfalls, the implications of the recently passed California SB 253 regulation, and how organizations like yours can find real return on investment from their carbon strategies. With me today, we are so excited to be joined by a panel of experts from 3R Sustainability. With us, we have Miranda Rankin. Hello.
Hi, it's nice to meet you all. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about carbon. My name is Miranda Rankin. I oversee all of our climate and greenhouse gas services at 3R, which extend from greenhouse gas inventories to science-based target setting, climate risk assessments, and really just trying to make sure everyone is prepared for the two California laws going into effect in 2026. So happy to dive into that.
We also have with us Gina McElraith.
Hi, I'm Gina, and I lead our 3R Sustainability Assurance Division, titled Sustainability Assurance Services. I have more years than I like to admit in sustainability related to implementation of sustainable operations and auditing and certification services. I'm excited to take on the next step beyond the carbon calculation and into the verification process.
Excellent. We're happy to have you both here. Thank you so much. It's great to have representation both from the greenhouse gas reporting side and the assurance side from 3R Sustainability. All right, let's take a look at our session topics. So session topics today, common pitfalls and best practices, preparations for California SB 253, and how to leverage ESG to benefit the company beyond just compliance. After we have our little bit of fireside chat here discussing these topics with our experts, we are going to open up the webinar for audience Q&A. So please, if you have any questions that come up, take a note and sit tight, and we'll let you into communicate those in a little bit. So let's get started. All right, first question. Let's start with general ideas. Miranda, has carbon accounting become more challenging, and if so, why?
Great question. So it's definitely become, more challenging over the past 5 years, we'll say, kind of looking at this in a pre-pandemic, post-pandemic world. Some of the main reasons for that increase in challenge is that greenhouse gas reporting continues to garner more attention from different stakeholders. It's not just your employees and the right thing to do anymore. It's coming from customers, it's coming from investors. The scrutiny is coming from regulatory compliance-driven areas as well. So because of this increased attention, it leads to trying to get better data and being more transparent in your emissions, in your calculations. And with that, data collection comes the increased burden of understanding where to get that data from, who owns it within your organization, what do you do if you can't get it all? And then I would say kind of that third point following the challenge of data collection is really the note around scope 3. So again, kind of using COVID-19 as a point in time. Pre-COVID, it was more common and more widely accepted to just start with scope 1 and 2 and kind of stay there. Scope 1 and 2 being the emissions associated with your direct operations. And now we're seeing a huge uptick in the demand for scope 3. Again, tying it back to kind of the different stakeholders, scope 3 is being driven by the laws coming out of California, Europe. It's being driven by customer requests it's basically saying scope 1 and 2 is no longer sufficient, given that majority of companies, scope 3 is their largest scope of emissions. So I would say that, increased attention from stakeholders, the continued increase in data collection, and accounting for scope 3 are kind of the main challenges as to why we've seen is the reason why we've seen the challenge with carbon accounting.
All right. Gina.
I was going to say, I'll add to that in a broader sense, the other stakeholders we're starting to see come to the table because of the added scrutiny as accounting, finance, legal, leadership. And so not just directly from the selection and carbon counting specifically, it's getting more questions, more scrutiny, and more emphasis from different departments that used to not be involved in sustainability. So while in the short term it feels like it's slowing things down, in the long term it's making it much more effective, and that we are getting many more decision makers and influencers to the table. So being able to not just collect the information and have the inventory, but also then be able to use that information, and having multiple departments and multiple functions in the organization understand it and be able to speak to it and utilize the information to drive change.
Absolutely, absolutely. I asked at the top, has it become more challenging? And I realized that my question had a built-in audience of built-in assumption, more challenging to whom? And that assumption would be to the folks in the sustainability teams who've been doing such good work for a while. But the process has gotten more complicated because we have more parties in it, both internally and externally. So beyond regulation, we have additional complexity factors that we've talked about. We've talked about the stakeholders. We're going to talk more about regulations. Would we say that data sources have any changes in data sources have contributed to the increased complexity for both carbon accounting and assurance of emissions numbers? Gina, we'll start with you.
So yeah, related to verification and the data sources, it is really interesting in that, especially when you get into scope 3, but even just thinking about scope 1 and 2, you are beginning to pull from a variety of different areas. You think traditionally with scope 1 and 2, it's electricity and natural gas, assuming that you have a general understanding of an inventory. But I think the areas that is really adding complexity, and as we're getting more complete inventories, are bringing in fugitive emissions, mobile combustion, and vehicles, and where do those fit in the inventory. And specifically thinking about verification, we're looking to ensure that items or different emissions are being accounted for in the right place and correctly. And then thinking about that at a higher end, related to the different stakeholders that are looking at the verification or the inventory, is the complexity around is it an investor? Is it for a rating system? What are the different ways that you can look at your inventory? But having a variety of different areas that you're getting pulled into, and then also a variety of different audiences for your work, which means that you're getting some different factors in different areas that you're looking at.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the additional stakeholders and the additional audiences, the additional eyes on carbon accounting numbers are requiring new data to be brought in that was not previously considered part of the process always.
It's recognizing that we were missing some pieces potentially, as more as I would explain it. Yep.
Okay. Hey, Miranda, anything to add to that?
No, I think Gina covered it really well.
All right. Well, So let's talk about the changes to the carbon accounting process. So it's gotten more complicated. It's gotten more due to additional stakeholders, due to additional data sources. But let's put on our hats and think of the folks who are doing this for the first time. Okay, not the folks who are have been doing this for 5 years. What are some of the most common pitfalls you see when folks are starting to do their carbon accounting program for the first time?
I think Gina hit on it really well in her explanation, which is, a lot there tends to be kind of when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, you think about an electricity utility bill, you think about a natural gas utility bill. And so that's a great starting point. Um, as Gina mentioned, there are several other elements, even just within scope 1 and 2, that go beyond just those utility bills for a building. You can talk about mobile combustion. If you have a manufacturing facility and you have forklifts on site, if those forklifts use propane, like that is also needing to be included in your inventory. If you have, HVAC, AC units, those are likely using some type of refrigerant to help with its cooling process. And if that refrigerant leaks, that's also part of your greenhouse gas emissions calculation. And so there are more things that kind of go beyond what you might just initially think to include. And so not including those is typically like a mistake or a shortcoming that we'll see companies starting off with on this journey, maybe in their first year. The other one I would say is not enough documentation or documenting the process. So, your first year, if you're doing it in-house, super common to use an Excel workbook, which is great. What we find is that, you still need to figure out where you're going to get your emissions factors from, what year those emissions factors were published, what source they came from. And a lot of that typically isn't documented. So if you were to work with a assurance organization to audit your inventory, if you were to work with another consultant in the future years to calculate your inventory, that lack of documentation can just kind of start to cause confusion in being able to do a fair year-over-year comparison of your emissions. So it can kind of take away from, okay, we saw a massive increase or decrease, but we don't really know why because we have all these other variables, emissions factors, sources that we can't connect the dots on. We don't know where they came from. So that not documenting or lack of documenting your processes is another big one. An Excel sheet that shows your calculations isn't enough by itself. The other thing that I would say, not so much mistakes, but just common holdups, if you will, or barriers, would be striving for perfection over progress. The big data dump, the concern about data. These are two things that we see a lot of companies struggle with. So, waiting to publish an inventory until they get that perfect data set. The unfortunate reality is that perfect data set is probably never going to happen, or it's a maturity thing. It's not going to happen until you start doing this for a few years. And so I think that level of comfort and being able to document what you did have for that year and how you got the numbers helps alleviate some of the concern and discomfort with not having a perfect data set. And, that kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of a restatement. A restatement for a greenhouse gas inventory does not carry the same weight as a restatement when it comes to financials. We know that when the word restatement gets thrown around in legal or accounting or in the room, they're like, whoa, like that is not something we want to do. And while obviously even in greenhouse gas accounting, you'd like to avoid it where possible, companies restate their emissions very regularly. And that's just because better data comes to light. Maybe they weren't using the best emissions factors. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is one of the most widely used and referenced standards in this space, talks about restatements and how to handle them because they acknowledge and understand that companies will do that very regularly. So I think that getting more comfortable with those kind of holdups or barriers also really helps move this process forward and allows companies to advance it much more quickly.
All right, thank you for that. Something that comes to mind when I think about the first time carbon accounting is folks might be a little shy about actually getting their first-time numbers put through third-party assurance. Gina, would you recommend that companies attempting carbon accounting for the first time skip assurance, or should they include it from the beginning?
Uh, Definitely recommend starting from the beginning. The key point there is because it really helps to have that that independent auditor look at it and may help you find some of those potential mistakes early. As Miranda was describing, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different ways that you can make mistakes. And if you have a start to an audit, even a gap assessment, it does help identify potential issues, and so you don't make that same mistake year after year after year, waiting until it's absolutely required to do an assurance engagement. It really does slow down the process. Or if you identify something now, then you have to go back and fix it many times. Just like getting a paper graded, essentially. If you make the same mistake several years in a row, it's going to hurt your grade, so to speak. But in this case, we're really thinking about having that opportunity to have a third party sustainability expert look at it, look at your inventory, and ensure that you're headed down the right track, and help identify a lot of those issues along the way.
Okay, so the auditors are your friends. They are serious
Yes.
people, but this is nothing to be concerned about. We should be transparent, we should be
Mhm.
open, and as Miranda was saying earlier, it's more okay to restate than in financial accounting. It is a separate discipline with a separate set of standards. It is acknowledged that with only a couple exceptions, many companies are very, very new at this. So the process is, I don't want to say forgiving, but I'll say very, very fair to meet you where you're at.
Mhm.
Okay, something pop into mind right now. Just question for both of you. Would you recommend that companies that get started with this invest in an emissions management or greenhouse gas accounting platform for their first year, or would you recommend that they, well, what would you recommend?
I'll take it from the accounting side. Gina can take it from the auditor side. I will say that typically we recommend clients doing the good old-fashioned manual Excel workbook process. We find that when a client comes to us for the first time, they've never done an inventory, this is what we do with them. And it allows us to really work with the client, walk them through what we're doing, why we're doing, what data inputs we need, why we need those data inputs, what an emissions calculation actually consists of, and how you get to, 1,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and what that actually means. And so, because we take this very educational, hands on approach, it allows us to do a better job of identifying data gaps right off the bat, identifying the data owners, and creating a path towards progress on how they enhance and continue to evolve their inventory in the future. After they do this for the first year, maybe even 2 years, not only does the client's confidence grow in their understanding of greenhouse gas emissions calculations and reporting, but they also get better confidence in their data. And so that's when we suggest transitioning to a software platform, because then you have a much more automated process, but you feel really confident in what you're putting into that platform. A software the output is only as good as the input. So if you're working with someone that doesn't know what they're doing, your platform isn't going to say, hey, by the way, you only put in natural gas and electricity. You might have refrigerants, you might have X, Y, and Z. The platform's going to tell you, you put in electricity, you only put in 6 months, you're missing 6 months, we'll estimate it. So it does a great job of assessing what data is in the platform. It misses, though, what's not in the platform altogether. And so by doing the manual process, you get to address and kind of alleviate the risks of just missing that altogether in a software platform.
Makes sense to me.
Exact same thing from the verification side. Unfortunately, organizations who think I'll implement a platform, and I'm not speaking specifically to Green Impact here, but definitely seeing multiple, as everyone knows, there's multiple options out there. But if you rely on that platform specifically and assume it's going to answer all of your questions, I would assume, Kevin, that from your perspective too, that having a client that is familiar with or knows their scope will make it much easier for you to be able to best service that client too. So
Absolutely. At Green Impact, we meet people where they're at. It's a lot easier to meet you, though, if this is not your first time around, in terms of guiding you through implementing a rather sophisticated carbon accounting platform. The good news is that the marketplace for the carbon accounting platforms has matured over the past couple of years. We have clear industry leaders that have been tested by companies of all sizes, one of which is Net Zero Cloud that we specialize in. I would say, building off this conversation, that if you go through this once or twice in Excel, you're going to understand your process better, and it's going to help you make a more informed choice when it actually comes to selecting your platform that you're going to use once you've got your process down. All right. So let's talk about the 300-pound gorilla. One of the biggest things that hit our industry, California SB 253. This is a major regulation. I will say the major regulation in the United States. So let's talk about this from as many angles as we can, starting with what is it, if there's folks on the call who don't know, and when's it going into effect? And most importantly, what should companies be doing today to get ready for compliance with California SB 253, even if they don't have maybe a formal ESG program yet? And we'll start again with Miranda.
Great question. I'm personally so excited that this is moving forward, and that it hasn't hit kind of it's hit pushback, but it hasn't been derailed. So really, starting with what it is. So California passed 2 laws back in 2024, SB 261, which is all about climate risk. Happy to talk about that. I know that's not the point of this webinar. And then SB 253, which is all about greenhouse gas emissions and disclosure. SB 253 has a revenue threshold of $1 billion. CARB, which is the California Air and Resources Board, had a workshop May 29th where they started to put forth some additional guidance around what it means to do business in California, and then published additional guidance around what their current definition is as of July 9th. It is a very low bar in what doing business in California means. So I do want to be clear, it is not that you have $1 billion of business in California. It is much lower than that. This is simply saying that as a company, you have a $1 billion revenue threshold that you exceed, and that's globally. The reporting requirements starting in 2026, reflective of 2025 data, is scope 1 and 2, and there is a limited assurance, GINA, for example, requirement to that. The Scope 3 element comes into play in 2027, reflective of 2026 data. So there is a little bit of runtime for Scope 3. In terms of what companies should be doing, it would be, if you've never done an inventory before, I would highly recommend starting with a 2024 inventory now. While you'll need to then repeat the process with 25 data, using 24 as a test run, if you will allow you to start identifying where you have gaps in your data, what data is going to be difficult to gather, where you might have to use estimates, who's going to own that data collection, who's going to own the calculation. So figuring that out right now before it's like go time in 26 I can't recommend that enough. You'll be more familiar with your process so that when, 2025 ends, and it's the start of 2026, you'll, like I said, be more familiar. You'll know what needs to get done in order to meet the reporting deadlines in 26 for this law. That is one thing I will say. CARB has not come out and formally given the due date of when SB 253 will be due. But I would suspect it will be in the first half of the year, maybe going through the summer. So the sooner you can get started, definitely the better. The other thing I will say is that even though Scope 3 isn't slated to be reported until 27, I would not recommend waiting until, middle of 26 to start thinking about Scope 3. Scope 3 is very large. It encompasses up to 15 categories. Not all categories will apply to any given organization, but it is a lot. It's a big undertaking with a big data requirement attached to it. So the sooner you can get started with Scope 3, maybe you start with 2025 as kind of a test run, I would highly recommend. And then I'll pass it over to Gina from the assurance side as well.
Yeah, so the limited assurance requirement is on the 2025 or fiscal year 2025, so that may overlap into 2024. One thing, kind of two options as far as getting ready for assurance. If you are going to work on a 2024 inventory, as Miranda suggested, then completing or at least starting the assurance process with a gap assessment on that inventory is a really good idea. As I kind of mentioned before, the sooner you can get, the assurance eyes on your process, the sooner you'll know if you're on the right track. So that can be completed on any data set that's available. If you want to go through the process with 2024, then that is a great idea, because then it'll be much quicker. That's maybe a false promise. You'll definitely have identified areas and challenges potentially where you'll want to need to take care of those, and having that knowledge now versus 2 weeks before the due date, when we do know the due date in next year, is obviously advantageous. The other thing I will say is if you I also do not wait until 2 weeks before the due date and say, okay, I've got my inventory complete now, I'm going to go get it assured. That'll take me 2 days and I'll be ready 2 days before it's due. And an inventory verification can take anywhere. I think the quickest I've seen is around 2 weeks, and it can take significantly longer if there are corrective actions required that are material. So definitely want to get started on that as soon as possible, and identifying your assurance provider and getting on their schedule. I think the other thing that's important is there's a big push right now, and no matter who you have as your provider, ensuring that you're on their schedule and they know you're there and can slot you in. There's only so many providers and so many auditors, so getting that taken care of, at least thinking about that, is important. I'll also emphasize, when you're looking for an assurance provider, noting the competencies of that provider, having a sustainability professional who understands the requirements of greenhouse gas reporting and the difference between 1 metric ton of CO2, 10 and 100 and 1,000 metric tons of CO2 is important. There's a variety of different options out there, and I'm not saying one is, if you have an existing provider, that's great. If you're looking for one, I definitely would recommend looking for a provider that has proven sustainability assurance in their repertoire and their offerings.
Yes. So this is, in case this wasn't clear to the audience, this is a big deal. The passage of the legislation is a big deal. The requirements are totally achievable. They're totally reasonable, but it's a process that you need to take seriously. We need to create the time for it, and we need to make the appropriate internal allocations of resources. All right. So let's talk now. Let's shift a little bit to talk about why we're doing this. Okay. We had one very clear reason why we should be doing carbon accounting in our previous slide, but we can do a little bit better than that. So let's think about beyond compliance. What would a purposeful approach to carbon accounting look like? How can companies use carbon accounting not just for reporting, but to drive meaningful internal changes or generate value for the business? And we'll start with Miranda.
I think this is such an important question because, just reporting numbers that don't mean a lot to most people can be a very frustrating task if you're the one that's responsible for doing it. So I think 2 or 3 big points that I will always talk to with clients is it's, that consumer customer priorities. This is really turning into a opportunity for reputational gain if you're showing that you're committed to making a effort in terms of lowering your environmental impact by being transparent with how your company is taking its approach. We're finding that more and more companies, customers want to see that in their suppliers. They want to see that in their supply chain. Employees working at those kinds of companies want to see the action that their organization is doing to positively impact the planet. The other element that is almost the opposite of that is not just your reputational gain, but it's your revenue protection. So if you're just kind of operating as, business as usual, what we're finding is more customers in this space, you're talking big players, Estee Lauder, Microsoft, Walmart, so many are going to their tier 1 suppliers, even tier 2 suppliers at this point, and saying, I need you to give me this data. What are you doing to lower your emissions? Because those tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers are feeding into Walmart's scope 3 emissions. And so it's being able to just keep the contracts that you have with some of these organizations that are really driving this change. So I think that that's another interesting perspective to keep in mind when we talk about carbon accounting and just your overall ESG strategies, that revenue protection. And then the other one is increasing, resilience. Specifically in this case, we're talking kind of about climate resilience. And so we see every summer, planet gets hotter, more energy is needed to run air conditioning and to keep the power on. A great example is, Los Angeles has had multiple rolling blackouts or brownouts for the past few summers in a row. So this ties to greenhouse gas emissions, because if you can get a handle on understanding your energy, understanding your emissions, finding opportunities to reduce it, you're going to increase your resilience to what could be perceived as volatile or unstable markets such as energy supply. So being able to kind of get a better understanding and handle on that will also just kind of increase the overall resilience of your organization.
Miranda covered it.
Okay.
For sure. Great job.
Yeah, you're speaking to things that we've experienced directly here at Green Impact. We work with clients who are motivated because they're suppliers. They say, well, we weren't planning on doing this, but we live and die by B2B sales, and all of our clients are asking us for these numbers, and we don't really know how to give them to them. So it's not just a green sticker on your box of on your grocery store purchase anymore. It's something that is all throughout the economy. So one more question before we jump into Q&A from the audience. So We've talked about compliance. We've talked about value chain and customer loyalty, but let's talk now about hard non-GHG numbers. We find that at Green Impact that sometimes the client is enthusiastically engaged in ESG, and sometimes we find that they view this is just another expense. This is something that they just need to get done with, and that it's never going to return anything back to the business here. So let's from both sides of 3R here, is there a story where the process of going through GHG accounting and maybe assurance has generated some value or to the company that was not expected by a client?
So I'm going to wear both hats on this one because I have an example on both sides. So I had a consulting client who had been, doing a lot of good work, and was doing sustainability and ESG, specifically data management, for the purposes of because it mattered to the owner as a privately held company. But when they actually, when they came to us looking to, starting with measuring their carbon footprint and their greenhouse gas emissions, because that had been requested by a client or a customer of theirs, and beginning to look at all the other good work that they were doing, and as they started measuring these different areas and were able to compare their performance to other and talk about their performance and the measured approach, they went from being a competitor to having this information along, the being able to tell their story better with the data, having verified data added to their score, and specifically their EcoVadis score, having more information to include in their sustainability report. They had done a green one pager, so to speak, and with more information and all the different areas that we were looking at, they were able to develop into a full sustainability report, and with that achieved top supplier of their largest customer. They won the award worldwide, and this is actually a small Pennsylvania company, ended up being awarded a supplier of the year from their largest customer worldwide, and has made a significant difference in their performance, and just having the good work to talk about. On the verification side, definitely have seen the same thing where companies were able to recognize where there was some inaccuracies in their inventories, specifically in this case, and also in their sustainability reports, where we assure reports, and by using the assurance standards and ensuring that the information was assured, it was having that third-party verification and being able to go out to their investors, and in one case specifically their PE, private equity board, and demonstrate to them that they had done good work. It made a significant difference in how they were able to communicate and the confidence that their board had in them, particularly, especially when we were able to show the inaccuracies that were found and then corrected.
That is great stuff. It's always wonderful to hear that companies see the real value in this, not just in their consulting investments, but the return to the business of improvements in reputation, improvements in process, and just improvements in storytelling. So that was our last fireside chat question. We do have a couple minutes left in our webinar. So let's open up Q&A and let's have some questions from the audience. So I do see that we have a question from Gage here. So this is a good one and kind of a challenge. how do we deal with inconsistent or missing Scope 3 data from suppliers? So moving away from suppliers as company to suppliers as to the customers of suppliers. I'm trying to do my Scope 3 to comply with SB 253. I'm reaching out to my suppliers. The data is inconsistent. What's our recommendation to our clients?
I think the recommendation is documenting where you're getting the data from, and if you can have your suppliers provide any documentation that they have that supports their numbers. I think that, this is the unfortunate reality that we're running up against. People will pull, for example, data from CDP. CDP, if you're responding to that, you could put in whatever number you want for your scope 1 and 2. And if it's not third party assured, like, you just kind of have to accept it at face value. So I think the best thing companies can do is, if you don't have a software platform that has a, massive database of emissions factors, I think it's documenting where you're getting your emissions from, or your emissions factor sources from. So it is easy to go back and correct should you need to, for previous years, as better data comes to light. So the documentation piece is a huge one. I can't recommend it or emphasize it enough. I think the other thing too is, as you start to engage and build a better relationship with your suppliers, one strategy for doing that is looking at who some of your largest suppliers are. That's obviously easy if you don't have a diverse supply chain. So if you only have, a handful or maybe even 20 to 30 suppliers that constitute a good portion of your purchased goods and services, for example, you can start to work with them to determine the differences in their year-over-year emissions. So that first year, you kind of accept the numbers at face value. Maybe in year 2, you're like, great, this changed 40% compared to last year. Is there a reason for that? Is there anything substantial that happened in your organization? So as you start to establish that relationship with your supplier, you get more comfortable with the data they're giving you, you can then start to have some of those conversations that can hopefully lead to them either calling attention to, oh, wow, we didn't realize that, let's go back and look, or, bring up, this is why verification is a great option. So I think that kind of comes as your program continues to mature. I will say there are great resources out there. So when you work with a platform like Green Impact or others, that comparison does become easier to do as opposed to the manual comparison. But there are also other great sources out there. EcoVadis is a phenomenal, if you are a requester, great way to start collecting and engaging your suppliers on that front and getting that data. So those are kind of the initial documentation piece, and then just that year over year kind of engagement establishment with your suppliers are kind of the two big things I would say.
Anything to add, Gina?
The only thing I'd say is, inconsistent is always a challenge. And missing Scope 3 data, most inventories I see and verify at this point don't necessarily have supplier information at all. If they're lucky, they might have a supplier or two that has actual data that can be assigned. And so there are multiple ways of spend data, a variety of different ways that you can estimate your Scope 3 emissions as a place to start. And then, as Miranda was explaining, you can take that approach and then continue to refine the information. The other thing I see with the estimates, at least starting with estimates, is a way to demonstrate to both the supplier and to leadership of where, we use this number, we know it's not accurate, but this is the impact that it has. If we were able to have an actual data source, this would impact our emissions. And your suppliers can help you just like you're helping your customers if you're a B2B. And so it's just taking that same concept of how you're helping your customers with your reporting, and then having your suppliers report to you. But at least starting with that estimate gives you a place to a tangible way to say how getting accurate information will help and will impact the results of an inventory or of a Scope 3 estimate.
Yes, yes. I'll just add that as with Scope 3 supplier data, it's our industry is constantly evolving, and the processes we've had in place, some companies have gotten quite comfortable with Scope 1 and 2, and Scope 3 throws them for a loop. And then you see clients who have gotten comfortable with Scope 3 using sort of spend-based calculations. And that's a great place to start, but there's always room for improvement. So we're always working on improving our processes and improving our sources. And the industry is rising to meet us as both clients and suppliers on both ends of the supply chain are working through this together. So we are actually at time. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A bar. So I want to thank everybody for their attendance and their time today. Thanks again very much to Miranda and Gina with 3R. This is the first of our webinar series. I hope you'll join us soon for the additional sessions. We have a link on screen, greenimpacttech.com/carbon clarity, if you want to register for those. If you'd like to schedule a consultation with Green Impact, you can visit us at that greenimpacttech.com website, or you can email us sales at that website. And please consider 3R for your sustainability, greenhouse gas accounting, and your assurance needs. Contact info is here on the slide. And thank you so much for your attention. All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank
you. Bye.